All right, so today I want to welcome our speaker, Leyla Kabuli. She is a third-year PhD student, electrical engineering, comp sci department at the University of California, Berkeley, where she's a member of the computational imaging lab. Today, of course, she's going to be talking about lensless imaging. And she received her bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, comp sci, and a Bachelor of Arts degree, a BA degree in music at UC Berkeley, and graduating as the university medalist. So congratulations. Her research interests are in lensless imaging, holography, theoretical frameworks for computational imaging. Her research is supported by the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship and the Berkeley Fellowship. She is a concert pianist. And a little more on your bio, which I think they should know. When you don't know, I'm going to say this, but she's a member of this. She was a member of the San Francisco Symphony Youth Orchestra and won the Symphony's Youth Orchestra Concerto Competition. Received the National Young Arts Honorable Mention Award in both 2016 and 17. Received the 2016 and 2017 U.S. Chopin Foundation Scholarship and won first prizes in the Los Angeles Young Musician, E-Muse, American Protege, and the Wildflower Music Showcase International Competitions. Congratulations on that. So today she's going to talk about lensless imaging, and take it away.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. Yeah. So unfortunately, I'm not talking about anything related to piano today. I wish. Maybe that would have been more fun. But instead, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of my recent research in high-quality lensless imaging systems, from experimental work for analyzing systems, and some interesting theoretical foundations that hopefully we can all have some fun getting lost in. So before I start the technical portion of my talk, I was asked to give a little bit of an intro and overview on who I am. Now, I realize a lot of the speakers for this seminar have been later on in their careers, so my timeline's a bit short, but I think it's still good to know kind of where I am at and where I might want to go in the future. So I've been at Berkeley literally forever. I did my undergrad here being in Berkeley, and then starting in 2017. And to kind of make things even worse, I was born in Berkeley. So at some point, I really should leave Berkeley. But so for undergrad, as was said, I did double degrees in electrical engineering and computer science and in music. I thought this was a really great balance between technical work and creative work. And in my sophomore year, I was really lucky to start some research opportunities. I joined a medical imaging group working on magnetic particle imaging. And a year later, I joined the computational imaging group that I'm still in today. So when I graduated, I decided to stick around in the same group. And I work in this computational imaging lab advised by the wonderful Professor Laura Waller. So I've been really lucky to have all sorts of great mentors during my undergraduate and graduate work. And they've really been critical in motivating what I'm working on today. And I hope that if and when I get to graduate someday, I can also go into academia and teach and start my own lab and carry on that mission. So in addition to all these wonderful mentors that I've had during my graduate and undergraduate experiences, I'm very thankful for some actually industry research opportunities that I've had that have really shaped my directions in research. So my first research experience in medical imaging actually led to an internship at Apple in the exploratory design group. This was a super, super top secret group that did some really awesome work in optics. This was my first exposure to optics. And it actually, because of this group, I then switched to my current work in computational imaging. After I graduated undergrad, I spent a summer working at a startup in Berkeley called Zendar. They work on self-driving cars, and here I learned about synthetic aperture radar for the first time. It was a super collaborative and open environment, and I really enjoyed how my work was immediately put into production and was eventually published. And last summer, I was really lucky to work at Meta in the display research team, display systems research. I got to work with some of the most brilliant and well-known researchers in the entire computational imaging field. So it's been really influential for me to get to work with all of these different people and also at all of these different size companies and different teams, as it's given me a lot of exposure to different kinds of research cultures and groups. So I've gotten to try a lot of different imaging modalities and techniques during my industry and academic research applications. Many have been extremely different from the work I'm going to talk about today in lensless imaging. But just kind of as a sample, I worked a bit in synthetic aperture radar. I know there's some overlap with the groups here. I did some elevation mapping with interferometric synthetic aperture radar. And I've also worked a lot in holography, which is another sort of lensless imaging technique. I've worked on holography for optogenetics, so stimulating neurons in the brain using very fast spatial light modulators. And I've also worked at Meta doing virtual reality applications of holography. So that's kind of it for me for now. So I'm going to start to shift about actually talking about what I should be talking about for this talk. So to introduce lensless imaging, I'd like to first start with a traditional imaging system using a camera. In a traditional imaging system, we have our object, and we take a picture of our object and capture a sensor measurement. The sensor measurement, or the image that we get, pretty much looks exactly like the object that we have, and we can directly interpret this captured image. In lensless imaging, as the name suggests, we don't use a lens. Instead of a lens, we use a non-traditional optical element to capture the measurements. These non-traditional optical elements can be masks, which are typically amplitude or light-efficient phase masks, and these actually alter the incoming light from the object and produce something that no longer looks like the original object. Instead, you might get these sorts of superimposed copies of the object, or something that just looks like a grayed out square with no idea what it actually is. Removing this lens has some really interesting advantages. It allows you to make an imager that's extremely compact. So rather than having a bulky lens setup, I can have an imager that's less than even a millimeter thick and still get good images. It's also going to be super lightweight if I don't have a heavy glass lens to deal with. And it has a super wide field of view, as the field of view is just limited by how big the sensor is. But in order to actually go from this overlapping measurement to an image that I can interpret with my eyes, I need to combine the phase mask, which is an encoder, with a computational reconstruction algorithm, a decoder, to go from measurement back to reconstruction. So lensless imaging is a really great example of a computational imaging modality, where we're combining optical improvements with algorithmic improvements in order to kind of push the limits of what I could do with just one or the other on its own. In terms of algorithms for computational imaging and for lensless imaging, there's many types that we can use for decoding. This can range from traditional deconvolution approaches in a single step to iterative optimization approaches, and particularly exciting are cutting-edge deep learning and neural network-based approaches. Unfortunately, I'm not talking about the algorithmic end so much today, but I'd be happy to chat about it more later. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on the improvements that we can make for the encoder in this system. To understand this actually very simple imaging system, we can kind of start with the forward imaging model. The encoded measurement in lensless imaging, which I'm denoting by X, is formed from a convolution between the object and the system's point spread function. So the point spread function is, as the name says, the pattern that a point makes as it passes through the system and spreads out. So for example, I have a point spread function here of 5 points. So my lenslet array will produce 5 points from a single point. And when I convolve it with my object, I'll get 5 superimposed penguins. In a physical system, we actually use a cropped convolution because our sensor is limited in its extent. So where you see on the edges, parts of the penguin might get cut off based on the sensor measurement. But when we're looking at the imaging model, it's just this convolution. We often ignore the crop because it's simple enough to omit. The key concept that we can think about with this encoding scheme, with this convolutional model, is the idea of multiplexing. How does this point spread function spread out the light, and how does it affect the output measurement? In a traditional imaging system with a lens, the point spread function is a single point. So the input point directly maps to one output point. This is a low or no multiplexing system. In contrast, if I have, for example, 5 points as my output mapping, I have a one-to-many mapping, and my measurement is no longer directly what the object is. This is a moderately multiplexing system. I have a one-to-many mapping in my system. In practice, our multiplexing systems are not quite as simple as just 5 points on a screen. And we're not limited to even working with points. For example, diffuser cam is a very common, popular lensless imaging system, and it uses a diffuser as its encoder. This diffuser has a point spread function, or PSF, that looks nothing like the points before. It's extremely high multiplexing as it maps a single point to many points on my detector scheme. So I'm talking to you a lot about this multiplexing thing, and I'm going on and on about it, and I promise there's a good reason. So when I have multiplexing, I have this one-to-many mapping, there's a really cool property. Lensless imagers can use multiplexing to compressively encode high-dimensional properties in one 2D measurement. So for example, previous work has done 3D imaging in a single shot. I can get my X and Y positions as well as my depth information from one picture by using multiplexing. We can also do video from stills. We've been able to do 4,000 frame per second video reconstructions from one capture by using the rolling shutter and this multiplexing scheme together. And what might be of interest to some people here today is our work in doing single shot hyperspectral imaging. We can take a single image using one of our diffuser encoders and get an entire hyperspectral data cube out from that single shot. So with all these advantages, lensless imaging is, I think, pretty cool. There's a compact form factor, it's a lightweight imaging system, it's low cost, and it has wide field of view, and maybe most appealing, it can do this multiplexing and do single shot high dimensional imaging. With these benefits, in addition to photography, some interesting applications include microscopy and in vivo imaging. For example, we've built a diffuser scope that can take images of fluorescent objects, such as this tagged brine shrimp on the left. And we have collaborators and other groups that have actually been able to do in vivo imaging with unrestrained primates and look at the neural activity just from a lensless microscope. So I'm giving you all of these advantages, but unfortunately, there are some drawbacks to lensless imaging. It's too good to be true otherwise. So lensless imaging is great because it's so compact and low cost, and it can do this single shot multiplexing. However, in contrast, a traditional imager can't do this, right? A traditional camera is going to be expensive on the order of thousands of dollars. And I can't do single shot 3D from one picture. I'd need to take multiple pictures. But a traditional camera gives me really high quality images. It looks almost photorealistic at this point, and super high resolution images. Lensless imagers, unfortunately, don't. So the signal to noise ratio, or SNR, in the measurements is reduced, and this leads to lower quality images and lower resolution images due to the encoders I'm using. So it'd be really nice if we had some way of getting towards a middle ground, where I could have high quality imaging, high resolution, but also still a compact multiplexing scheme. So this is where some of my recent work in lensless imaging fits in. We built a new imager last year and the year before that was able to give us a kind of happy medium, where we're maintaining our compact hardware, we're maintaining our single shot multiplexing abilities, but we're improving the quality and the resolution of our systems. So in this next part of the talk, I want to talk about this imager that I built. And kind of as a teaser, we use an improved phase mask. It's made of a bunch of random multifocal lenslets. And this lets us get much higher resolution and higher quality with less artifacts, reconstructions, compared to the previous state-of-the-art diffuser cam. So our phase mask is an example of a kind of encoder improvement that we can do for these lensless imaging systems. Optimal phase mask design is a really hard problem. It's an open question, and there's lots of us trying to figure it out. So we're still trying to get towards there, and this is just a heuristic design to start. The original diffuser cam used this sort of a Gaussian diffuser. This is an off-the-shelf component that you can buy from Thor Labs or Edmund Optics, and we're able to just shine light through it and create this caustic pattern. But there's some problems with this caustic pattern. So it's extremely highly multiplexing, which can actually reduce my signal to noise ratio because all my measurements overlap too much. And it kind of suffers from reconstruction artifacts and other losses of quality because it diverges a lot of light and it has a non-zero background. So it's taking more of a quality hit than I'd like because it's so big and so spread out. Recently, in our group, the Fourier diffuser scope and the mini scope, two examples of single-shot 3D imaging with lensless imaging, used a random multifocal lenslet design. For our lensless imager, we adapted a similar design to be used for photography scale imaging, and the PSF is shown here. It's very different from the one I showed you on the previous slide. It's comprised of these lenslets that have different focal lengths. So the points in yellow are in focus, and the points that are geometric shapes in blue are defocused lenslets. And they're at different positions, somewhat pseudo-randomly placed across the field of view rather than a regular grid. Our design is pretty advantageous over something like a diffuser because it's still multiplexing. Less so, it's spreading to fewer points. But because it's spreading to fewer points and because it concentrates light in regions similar to a lens, we improve our light collection and we improve our resulting SNR and performance in the system. So I'm talking about this design, and it's great if we can just come up with new designs, but there's a pretty big bottleneck at this point, and that's actually manufacturing these sorts of different designs. And the answer to try to manufacture starts with us first finding a height map to describe the system that we want to build. So this is the phase mass surface height map for the PSF that I showed you on the previous slide. The lenslets are these different circles that are randomly positioned, and the heights of each lenslet range from 0 to 40 microns. Each one's about 100 microns in width as well. So the parameters for this design were heuristic, and they were tailored to the Fourier diffuser scope, not for lensless imaging, but it's a pretty similar scenario for us to use because both are far-field imaging scenarios. You might notice there's some Mickey Mouse ears on this design. Those were actually two other lenslets arrays that we designed for use in a miniscope, a different application, not lensless imaging, but with similar multiplexing capabilities. Anyway, so we have this height map, and what we did is we found a company in the UK, Power Photonic, and asked them to manufacture this for us. They said, sure, at a very, very steep price, they'd manufacture it, and they gave us a mold according to the specifications. And so given this mold, we took PDMS polymer, poured it in there, and we were able to generate the phase masks from that mold. So it's a pretty costly process to manufacture this right now. We do hope to find ways that are less costly in the future. But even if we're stuck with this mold, the cost is somewhat offset if we were to build thousands of imagers. We pay one time for the mold, and we can keep manufacturing with low-cost polymer as we need. Okay, so we have our system that we've manufactured, and as we described previously, the forward model is going to be this cropped convolution. So our sensor measurement X is equal to the crop of my object, the lovely Patrick the penguin, convolved with the system point sort function, which is these randomly positioned lenslets. Given this forward model, if we want to recover our image of the penguin, we actually need to do a little bit of computation. So this is going to be my one computational slide for the talk. Fortunately, I'm not going over more, but essentially, we can reconstruct our images, for example, using optimization. Here I use simple least squares. And so my challenge here is to say I have my sensor measurement X, and I have my system model O convolved with H. I want to see if I can come up with a reconstructed image O hat such that when I pass it through the forward model, I have the least amount of error with my measurement. I want measurement consistency, and I'm minimizing the error in that measurement. I also add a non-negative image intensity constraint because my real objects are not going to have negative values in them. Typically, we also use a regularizer in this equation. We'll add an L1 norm to enforce sparsity of the object. And this is super critical when we're working in 3D and single-shot high-dimensional imaging, because if we're solving a compressive sensing problem, it's underdetermined. We need to add more constraints for it to work. Here, I'm omitting the regularizer because I'm only working in 2D imaging for now. So it's simple enough that it's going to be a straightforward problem. But do remember that there is some amount of sparsity. And to actually solve this optimization problem, I'll use Vista with 250 iterations. Happy to talk more about that later if needed. So we know how to make our system. We know how to reconstruct our system. Before we actually look at some images, we want to see what's the theoretical performance that we can get to kind of have a concrete measure of the improvement compared to the previous system that we've used in this application. So we use the autocorrelation of the PSF as a measure of this performance. And basically, the autocorrelation says that if I have high peak width on the sides, I'm going to have a hit to my SNR. The lower my peak width is, the better my system quality is going to be. The reason for this is when I look at the autocorrelation, I take my pattern and I shift it around all these different positions. The more overlap I have when I shift the pattern compared to its original point, the less confident I am that I'm in one point versus the shifted point. If I shift my pattern just a little bit and I get a huge drop in the correlation, I know exactly where my position was, and that helps me reconstruct the system. So with diffuser cam, I'll shift it a few pixels and I'll still have these side lobes. It makes it hard for me to know exactly where my object should be. But with the RML, side lobes drop almost immediately to 0. I can very clearly tell where my position should be. And just kind of to visualize, you can imagine the pattern shifting up and down and try to compare it to the centered pattern, and you'd see it would vary. In terms of resolution, how fast that pattern drops off also quantifies the resolution. So the narrower the full width half max is in that center, the better my resolution will be. And in this case, it's marginally a little bit smaller. I didn't sample it finely enough to give you a very precise number on that. Okay, so here I have some simulated reconstructions of a particular Patrick the Penguin target with 3 classic imaging systems. We have flat cam from Rice University, diffuser cam, the previous one from our lab, and the RML imager, which is the one I'm developing now. And we can measure each of the system's performance by looking at a few scalar metrics. So we look at mean squared error, peak signal to noise ratio, and structural similarity index metric. And we want as low of MSE as possible and higher PSNR and higher SSIM for a good performance. And we can also look at this qualitatively and see that, by eye, clearly the RML imager is much higher quality. It's closer fidelity to what it should be. And we can look at the resolution by kind of zooming in on the bow ties and seeing that there's a lot less noise and artifacts with the RML compared to the other 2 systems. So now we get to maybe the more fun part, the physical imaging system with some experiments. So the physical imaging setup, to start, I worked with a phone placed in front of the system. And the system is just the phase mask and the sensor superimposed next to each other. So we image our object by displaying the object on the phone screen. This simplifies our setup because now we have our illumination and our object integrated. Otherwise, I have to then, point a lamp at my object and hope that it's reflecting at the correct angle. If I want to get some baseline tests, it's convenient to have it on my phone. Here we have a result for the US Air Force standard resolution target, displayed on a phone screen and captured with the system. On the left is the diffuser cam result, and on the right is the RML imager. Can also zoom into the center to see the resolution and quality improvements between the 2 systems. You might also notice if you look at the sensor measurement, the diffuser cam measurement just looks like a few grid points, but it's overall grayed out, whereas the RML imager measurement kind of looks like just the superimposed copies. It's a little easier to separate out what the object is in that case. Here are the results from our phone screen illuminated object for Patrick the Penguin. And again, the RML imager has higher quality. And we can see that in the diffuser cam case, the sensor measurement looks nothing like a penguin anymore. It's just completely grayed out. So this is what I'm talking about when I say too much multiplexing might be a saturation point or a hit to your SNR. If you can't really separate out the image content, it's hard for you to undo it and get a good image out. And our favorite bow tie metric, same thing on resolution, can resolve it a bit better than we can with the diffuser cam. So now we get to the harder experimental setup. This is where some of my results are going to look a little less good. In this setup, we place a physical object in front of our lensless imaging system and use an external illumination source to illuminate our object. We have to make sure we illuminate it in a way that the reflected light off the object is captured by the sensor. Here's some examples of the performance of the RML imager on real objects with external illumination. This is an example with a school bus. I was unable to get a good reconstruction with diffuser cam. Diffuser cam is harder to use. It's harder to align it, harder to get a good illumination position. So the best I could do was this blurry situation of a school bus. In contrast, the RML imager, I just shined my flashlight on it and I was able to capture pretty clear image of the school bus. You can even kind of read the text on the side. But now this is experimental and it's 2 different lensless imaging systems, so it's hard for me to register them and align them perfectly. So just kind of rotate it in your mind to get an idea of the comparison if you need a more aligned system. Here's another example with a rubber duck that has faster changing structure and some specular effects. Diffuser cam was, again, pretty hard for me to actually get a full duck. It's missing its neck. And the RML imager was a little bit closer up but it was able to capture all the details of the duck, and you can see those specular effects shining off of some of the portions of the duck. Here we have a small bonus gallery of color images from the RML imager. We have Patricia the penguin and the lovely Thorlab's dog as examples. I think in color, it's nice to highlight the improved quality that you get, and color is a bit more forgiving on artifacts. These were actually captured by one of my wonderful undergraduate mentees, Clara. So she's been the lab master for the color version of this system. Okay, so we made it through the first half of my talk. We demonstrated this heuristically designed imaging system that gave us improved quality and resolution for lensless imaging. We used a reduced multiplexing design. We used a lower one-to-many mapping in order to get this improvement in image quality. So we have some intuition here on what a good design might be. If we reduce multiplexing, we get better quality. But this doesn't quite give us a design principle yet, because if we keep reducing multiplexing forever, we reach the limit of a lens, and we don't want to work with a lens. So there must be some optimal middle ground, some trade-off space that we could map better. So now I want to transition into the more theoretical and analysis-based portion of my talk to kind of give you some principles on the design of high-quality systems in this field. So I'd like to show how we can study the effect of objects and different encoders with different multiplexing levels, and to see if this might change depending on the imaging setting that I'm in. If I have a way of analyzing this, I can have a better way in the future of designing these systems to maximize my performance. So if I want to evaluate and design an encoding system, I need a metric that will let me quantify the performance of the system. If I look at traditional methods, these will evaluate the image quality of my reconstructions. So there's two types of evaluations that I can do traditionally for lensless imaging. If I have my ground truth available, if I know exactly what my object is and its position, I can use the standard metrics I used previously, mean squared error, PSNR, SSIM. Mean squared error and PSNR are kind of not ideal to use because they're not perceptually motivated metrics. They don't always agree with what your eye perceives as being an accurate reconstruction. And PSNR tries to mitigate that a bit. It's more perceptually motivated. But again, I need this pixel line ground truth to work with. My other options when I don't have ground truth. This is a realistic situation. For example, the school bus, I didn't have a ground truth. If I'm in microscopy and I'm imaging cells, I don't necessarily have a ground truth available. So I can't use these scalar metrics. A lot of the times, I'm then limited to how well my eyeballs can evaluate the system. I can qualitatively assess the quality of the system. I can look at the artifacts. I can look at the resolution based on my eye. Or I can also look at the fit of my system to the forward model. So if I have a good approximation of how my image is generated, I can look at the error there. But this also has some limitations, especially if my forward model is simplified like the one I showed you, or if there's non-idealities, noise, piece of dust on my system, all of this will still break down. So we have these traditional evaluation methods. They're all based on reconstruction-based evaluation. So we go through the entire encoder-decoder pipeline. We get our reconstruction, and we give that reconstruction a score. But I don't know with this reconstruction if a particular performance improvement is due to the decoder or due to the encoder. The decoder, these algorithms, have a bunch of hyperparameters to tune. So you can spend hours tuning it and picking the best weights so that you get a good reconstruction out. But if I'm spending forever tuning that, or if I'm using a more powerful algorithm, that's not going to answer if my hardware is good enough. I'd really like a way to be able to say, I know exactly where I can improve my encoder without these confounding factors from the decoder and the entire imaging pipeline. So this brings us to an alternative we've proposed for encoder evaluation. So we developed a framework that uses information theory to compare encoding systems based on objects and encoders. And we do this with something called mutual information estimation. And I'm going to try to give you a high-level explanation of that. So mutual information is a concept from information theory that quantifies how much observing one variable, the sensor measurement, can reduce uncertainty about another variable, your object. So if you want to know how good an encoder is, one way you could do this is see how much information is contained in my sensor measurement. The more information is in my sensor measurement, the more certainty I have on what my object is. And if I have more certainty on my object, I've encoded that object's information better. This lets us isolate just the encoder in the system rather than going through this uncertain process with the decoder. And also lets us compare encoders and look at how different objects, for example, if I switch from a penguin to a cell or a fluorescent bead, how those may vary the encoder performance. We also don't need ground truth with this metric, since we're only looking at the sensor measurement, which is also advantageous because now we can use this for systems where we don't have a registered ground truth capture. Okay, so mutual information estimation, this framework that we're doing, doesn't use the reconstruction, and it works with distributions of images rather than single images. So we have to throw away, in part, our single object image formation model and move towards a probabilistic imaging model that works with distributions of images rather than with individual objects. So there's a few things that are the same and a few things that are different. Rather than a single object, I'm going to work with a capital O distribution of many objects on the order of thousands of objects, for example. Each object will be encoded following the regular convolution model we have. And this will form our measurements, these noiseless images. So the noiseless images will be a distribution, thousands of these outputs. But there's something I've been omitting until now, and that's noise. When I detect something with my camera, I'm inevitably going to have error, I'm going to have variations, I'm going to have noise. So I want to also model noise in the system. So now we have the randomness of different objects and images, plus randomness due to detection, which we model with Poisson noise. This forms our final distribution, our noisy sensor measurements Y. And what mutual information says is I look at those noisy sensor measurements Y, compute this number that tells me how many bits of information I have, and I can use that to evaluate the encoder performance. So mutual information quantifies the amount of object information that's encoded in the measurement, and I can evaluate and compare my encoders by doing this. But the question is, how do we compute this weird term? First key is that information can be represented in terms of another quantity, entropy. So entropy is denoted by a capital H. Entropy measures the randomness or unpredictability of a distribution. Higher entropy for images means that pixel values are broadly distributed and random. So I can't just arbitrarily pick a pixel value and be correct. It's unpredictable. So in order to compute information, we break it down into two terms related to this entropy. The first is the entropy of noisy sensor measurements, H of Y. This quantifies how much pixel variation there is in my measurements. The second term is the conditional entropy due to noise. This quantifies how much of the variation is just because I'm using shot noise, because that's not inherent to the actual object and encoded systems behavior. That's just the deterministic behavior of noise. So if I want to know how much about my object I can infer from my measurements, I look at the variation in the measurements and remove the variation due to noise. That's my information. So to compute this first term, we use a bit of machine learning magic, because entropy is notoriously hard to compute in high dimensions. So we do this by fitting a probabilistic model to the data set. We use a neural network, actually a generative model called a pixel CNN. And what a pixel CNN does is I can train on a data set, and when I have a good fit, I can actually generate new images that look like the distribution of images that I trained on. So for example, here we have the MNIST data set. Top row is the pixel CNN samples after it's been trained. Bottom row is real data. Pixel CNN generated a 9. So it's able to capture the distribution's randomness and variation pretty well. When I can do this with these sorts of generative models, I'm able to compute something called the negative log likelihood on a test set. Basically, how good the model fit is. And this negative log likelihood is a tight upper bound on the entropy. It's a bound on H of Y. So I estimate H of Y by using machine learning magic. For conditional entropy, my life is a lot easier, thankfully. Conditional entropy is just what the behavior of the noise is, and this is an analytic expression for different noise models. For example, for shot noise, it's just going to be the sum of a bunch of pixel intensities for pixel k of each image x, summed over all of the different images I. So I just calculate all of the pixel variations, and that's my second term. So we have this framework. This lets us isolate object and encoder performance by calculating this metric using machine learning and analytic noise models. I'm going to start with a simpler case of how we can use this to analyze system performance by looking at different data sets. And we want to look at different data sets in order to evaluate the performance depending on object sparsity. If you remember, it's been like 20, 30 slides at this point, but I mentioned that in the reconstruction algorithm, we usually use a sparsity constraint because it's a compressive sensing problem. So if I have different amounts of sparsity, my reconstruction performance is affected by how good my reconstruction can do on that. So because object sparsity affects this performance for these compressive imaging tasks, we do want to understand if this is going to affect the kind of encoder we want to work with. So we have our different objects, and we can try to compare our encoder performance. One way we can compare our encoders is to vary one parameter while keeping everything else fixed. And specifically, we can look at the amount of multiplexing that we have. Because we saw with the RML, reducing our multiplexing a bit gave us better quality. We want to see if that's the same for these objects. To look at this in a controlled way, we just look at lensless-based systems. So we go 1 through 5 lenslets. The more lenslets I have, the higher my multiplexing is for my system. And now we get one of the interesting results that I can get with this mutual information framework. So for each data set, I look at the mutual information for the output, the sensor measurements, for each of the multiplexing levels. And I'll start with the CIFAR-10 dataset, which is natural images. These are the least sparse images. When I have a single lens, I have the most information. And as I increase my multiplexing, I lose information. This is kind of in agreement with centuries of camera design. We use a single lens because that gives us the best capture of our object. When I use more than one lens, I'm degrading the image quality. I lose my information. But something kind of interesting happened when we looked at these more sparse data sets. For example, for MNIST. This data set is super sparse in that it has very few non-zero components in its image. When we overlapped these sparse objects by increasing the multiplexing level, rather than it going down in information, it actually went up. And the reason is we're able to overlap objects and put more of them, like for example, 3 or 4 copies of this 5, without the overlaps of the numbers actually causing a saturation. For the CIFAR-10, if I take a bunch of frog images and I superimpose them, I'll eventually get a grayed out flat image. I won't be able to tell that there's frogs superimposed. But with the single digits, when I superimpose them and they're shifted around, I can still tell that they're 5s or that they're t-shirts or whatever those more sparse objects are. So they're tolerant to higher amounts of multiplexing because I have redundancy by overlapping them, but I don't lose information because I'm not reaching the point where all the pixel values in the image look exactly the same. So having some amount of redundancy when we have sparse objects actually reduces the uncertainty on what the object is and increases information. And so this idea of this like graying out, I can kind of visualize with these 2 example measurements here. On the left is an example of a highly multiplexing system and less sparse object content. And the entire image looks pretty much the same to me. It's super gray, and I can look at how little variation there is across the image by plotting this cross section in the middle. It very smoothly varies, it gets a little brighter, and then it falls off. In contrast, when I use a less multiplexing system for these dense objects, I can still separate out individual copies of my system. And when I look at the cross section, there's a huge amount of variation in what the measurement looks like. So when I have more variation, I have more confidence in what my object is. But if I have too much multiplexing, I lose that variation and I lose what my object content can be confidently. To zoom in on this a bit more, this trade-off between object sparsity and multiplexing, we used a bunch of data sets of synthetic data with tunable sparsity. So we looked at objects that had a ton of beads that were dense, all the way through objects that had just a few beads that are sparse. And we kind of put some numbers to it using something called the Tamura coefficient. So this is just a scalar. And basically, the higher the Tamura coefficient is, the more sparse the system is. We did the same encoding scheme as before, but swept all of these different object sparsity amounts from dense to the left on the x-axis through sparse on the right. And what we found is for the one lensed case, the highest information was when I had very dense objects, which made sense, and then it fell off. And for each of the higher multiplexing cases, the most information corresponded to a higher amount of object sparsity. As I increased more, my optimal information was with higher object sparsity. We found something pretty cool by looking at these maximum values from the previous slide. So these stars denoting the maximum information there. And we decided to look at what the measurements actually looked like in those maximally information cases. And what we found was that those measurements were actually qualitatively the same. The optimally encoded measurements had the same sensor sparsity. So even when I had a high multiplexing system and low and high object sparsity, as in the yellow on the very right, or if I had a very dense object with low multiplexing, all my sensor measurements, the outputs, map to the same thing, roughly. This is actually consistent with some ideas in coding theory that say that regardless of what your input distribution is, if you have an optimally encoded output, the output distribution will look the same. So if you wanted a really simple way of evaluating how informationally optimal a system was encoding, you could just kind of look at the measurements and see if it was close to this constant optimal sparsity level. So the last experiment we did kind of ties together the mutual information framework and this theory that I've dragged you through for the last while with the work that I did in the first half of my talk with a higher quality imaging system. So here we built an experimental setup to collect data sets from both the RML imager and the diffuser cam. Previously, I was working with single images, and I showed that the diffuser cam had worse quality than the RML. But in order to do my information estimation approach, I need to work with distributions or data sets. To make this simpler, we took a display, and we put 2 copies of each image for collection. That way, I had less optical alignment to do, because I didn't need both of the cameras to be perfectly aligned onto the display. And we used the MIRFlicker dataset, which is this huge open source dataset of 25,000 images. We took 1,000 of those, captured them with this setup. And what we found was that the RML imager actually encoded more information than the diffuser cam lensless imaging system did. We have the point spread functions with visualizations on the left, just as a reminder. The RML is much lower multiplexing. And when we're imaging these dense objects, low multiplexing, dense object combine for higher information. Diffuser cam, high multiplexing plus dense object takes a hit, the measurements just look graded out, and we have less information. And as we showed in the first half, the RML imager has better quality reconstructions, higher resolution reconstructions. We can verify that with the dataset images as well. And what was nice is now we were able to connect the performance we have with this heuristic system that happened to have lower multiplexing with an information theoretic evaluation of that encoder to see that it indeed was actually encoding better, which is why I was able to reconstruct better. So I introduced this RML imager, and it improved the image quality that you can get for lensless imaging. And we kind of learned that reducing the multiplexing when we're working with these dense objects really helped improve the performance of our systems. I also talked a little bit about this mutual information estimation framework, from which we were able to isolate some principles that show trade-offs between object sparsity and encoder multiplexing. And we're able to connect these two, this higher quality heuristic design, with some theory explaining why this design worked better. So we have a bunch of new methods that are available to improve lensless imaging, and I really hope that going forward it will let us create higher quality images for this system and get it closer to applications that we care about. So for example, I want to talk about a few directions of future work that I see for lensless imaging and maybe broader computational imaging as well. I think in vivo imaging is going to be really, really cool coming up. This is particularly useful to think about for lensless imaging because lensless imagers are super compact. So you can imagine an implantable device in your body that's able to take images with a compact system. I can't take a DSLR camera and stick it into my arm, but I could take a 1 millimeter thick thing and maybe implant it into a part of my body. So one direction within in vivo imaging is developments on chip scale imagers. This is actually an example of an implantable imager that some collaborators at the University of San Francisco, UCSF, are working on. They have this IC, integrated circuit, that is able to wirelessly capture images, so they could put it on a tumor in your body and track tumor growth over time. Where lens imaging could be interesting is instead of 2D imaging, we could do compact 3D imaging and track tumor growth in time and see the depth. Similarly, for intraoperative imaging, when you're doing surgery, let's say you're operating on a tumor and you're slicing away parts of the tumor. It'd be nice in real time to see, have I cleared my entire tumor? Where 3D could be helpful, or single shot imaging is helpful, is saying how much further in depth do I need to go to fully remove this tumor? And if I can do that in a compact probe that I put right there in surgery, that's a lot easier than slicing out the tumor, taking it to pathology, waiting and hoping that I don't have a recurring tumor or other infection there. Encoder design is something I'm talking about a lot, but something that we haven't done yet, because encoder design is pretty hard. Some options for encoder design harness machine learning, such as end-to-end approaches. And we have another option that we're proposing, which is information optimized design, which we call ideal. And the idea here is if we have a learnable lens array, something that we can differentiably propagate through a system, by testing its performance on a bunch of different measurements and computing the information, we can use that as a loss function for design. So rather than end-to-end, where you design your hardware and your decoder jointly, which requires a ton of computation because you have to go through the entire pipeline, we can just design the encoder and see, is it informationally optimal? And take gradient steps in order to maximize information. This is our visualization of our initialization, and then it converges down to just 4 or 5 lenslets as its optimal design using information optimization. So our mutual information framework, something I'm excited about because it's applicable in many areas, not just lensless imaging. Anywhere you want to compare some parameters that you're varying in your system, and anywhere you have a noise model, you can use mutual information. So we've applied our framework to other systems in microscopy scale imaging. We've done LED array imaging on the left, and we've done some Fourier diffuser scope work as well. But we're always looking for new application spaces for this work. I can think of actually, in fact, some hyperspectral imaging work that you're doing here could be very applicable. We're interested in looking at things like finding the optimal bands that you should measure for hyperspectral imaging and other application spaces, depending on the kind of data you might have. There's still a lot more that we have to develop here as well. Currently, we're using a GPU for computation, and it takes 30 minutes or more per information estimation that I do. We hope to speed that up, and that'll help move all of this work forward and make it more applicable so that we can have faster methods that are just as accurate. So yeah, I think that lensless imaging is super promising. I'm really excited to keep working in this field, and I hope that other people across the country and maybe here start working on lensless imaging as well. However, this work is not possible to do alone. I'm extremely thankful for the collaborators that I have, especially Henry on the left. He's a postdoc in our group who came to me with an idea for information theory 3 years ago. And everyone in our group thought we were crazy, but we kept pushing with it. And now we're starting to see it being used as an actual tool that's applicable. I'm also extremely thankful for my wonderful undergraduate mentee, Clara. She's just a junior, but she's been an absolute expert in the lab, taking all sorts of RML images, helping me collect data sets, you name it. I'm really thankful for funding from NSF. They've allowed me to explore whatever I want to do during my research, letting me go on these weird rabbit holes in information theory and everything else. And thank you to Waller Lab. It's been great to work with Professor Laura Waller and to have a great team around me to help me with all the things that I don't know how to do alone. So yeah, thank you all for listening, and please let me know what questions you have. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions, and correct me if I'm asking the wrong question. The first question I had was, as I understood, is that the space bandwidth product of this imaging system
Yes.
is dependent on the object also.
Correct.
Is that a limitation? Because then you don't have a universal phase marker. If the object changes, you might have a different optimum phase marker for the object.
That's a great question. So actually, mutual information is a higher level version of space bandwidth product, so it does incorporate that. obviously, if you're trying to image a variety of objects and you don't know what the properties of the object are, it makes no sense to design a system to maximize that kind of information throughput. In that case, it makes the most sense to maximize for the worst case object that you have, like a very dense object. So yes, if you want a more universal, something that works well for everything, you would want to probably minimize multiplexing in all cases. That's why we use a lens in most cases for imaging, because that's minimal multiplexing. But if I know, for example, I'm going to image fluorescent beads, or if I want to image very dense tissue, if I have a constraint on what kind of objects I'm working with, I can do better than that because I can take advantage of the object and the encoder jointly.
All the models we are using, that has to also affect the quality of reconstructions you get. And it's very simple thing is shift invariant model.
Yes.
It has no capturing of the partial coherence which might happen. So do you think if you include a partially coherent point spread function, however that is modeled, the reconstructions would improve?
That's a great question. So in photography scale imaging, which is what I'm focusing on here, we assume a shift invariant model because we say all the angles of light are coming in from a somewhat constrained angle. When I push to microscopy, this breaks. So actually, when we're working with microscopy scale imaging, we use a shift varying model, which means we calibrate a point spread function at every single point in our field of view. And then we cry as we use a bunch of deep learning to try to reconstruct an image from all of those spatially varying measurements that we have. So yes, it does improve our system to use spatially varying calibration and a spatially varying model, but we also have a lot of trade-offs there with computation. I have to manually acquire all those PSFs or somehow interpolate my PSFs, and I need to reconstruct that, which is harder. But you do bring up a great point. The more of these non-idealities I can capture in my forward model, the better I can do with an algorithm that's constrained to only looking at that forward model. Yeah, thanks for the questions. Thank you.
So because your encoder is often,
Mhm.
so do you have an estimate when this encoder, like how much variation you can take on the object side? How do you quantify that?
That's a good question. I think that brings up a good question in terms of a challenge in lensless imaging in general, because a similar challenge we have is manufacturing errors. We think we have one encoder, we come out with a different encoder, and we hope that the performance generalizes. That's not always the case. I think in this scenario, something I envision is if we do design, for example, information optimized, trying to account for the amount of distribution shift you may have by training on a wider range of objects than what you'd actually work with could help you with that. But eventually you do reach a limit where you try to image something that you absolutely cannot. Like if I take a lensless imager, even something like this, and I try to image a very dense object, I may not be able to get a reconstruction out. If I have the object zoomed out, so it's a smaller constraint, that helps improve performance, for example. So I do think that that's a big challenge going forward. And I think the best option we have is data and machine learning to try to mitigate the variation that we can have in the encoder or the variation in the object.
John, excellent talk, very interesting work. So in the first part of your talk, I was struck by the difference in the reconstruction between the user model camera and your RLM. And early on you said you never get something for nothing. And I'm just trying to reconcile what's causing the big difference in the reconstruction. Is it computation, or is it just that the optic design that you have is that much smarter and better and the other one is bad? Or why is there such a difference?
So, for example, in these images, all of the images I've shown are reconstructed with the same algorithm, exact same parameters. The reconstructions are fixed. So this is all improvements to the encoder. And the honest thing here is that the fix here was money. Our encoder that we use, the mold we manufactured, cost us almost $10,000. It was extremely expensive, and that does not scale well for low-cost imaging. Whereas the diffuser is $100 or $200 on Thorlabs. So there's a cost trade-off there, and there's a limitation in what you can do for manufacturing a custom optic depending on your cost. But when we're using a custom optic, that lets us do lenslets, focusing that light also helps us improve the quality. So most of the improvements here, nothing is about the decoder here. I tried to simplify the decoder just to highlight as much the encoder improvement. If we have better manufacturing techniques to reduce the cost of this, I think we could get similar improvement and get closer to this optimal performance without so much expense. Everything is identical. It's the computation is this no sparsity constraint, nothing, 250 iterations of FISTA. I plug in the same thing on both. And reducing the multiplexing, making H as few points as possible, also helps because it reduces your dependence on noise. If I have a ton of noise and I have my diffuser with this big pattern, it actually sometimes will diverge. And if I have like a very specular point or some other non-ideality, that's why the school bus, for example, blows up, because there's a really bright point on the shiny corner of the school bus, and the algorithm is unable to invert that really bright point and reconcile it with the rest of the object, which doesn't have the same specular effects. And this is also, I maybe could have tried a bit harder to make the diffuser cam look a little bit better, but it's not going to get to the quality of the RML imager. And that's another selling point we have, is that the RML imager is honestly almost idiot proof. Like, I barely align anything and it gives me a good image, whereas diffuser cam takes me 4 or 5 iterations, lots of pieces of duct tape and scotch tape, and if I touch something incorrectly, it breaks my whole system sometimes.
Tim, did you still have a question?
Oh, I just want to comment about the generalization of things. We also target things, right?
That's a great point you bring up. So I think that's a good direction to go in the future. I didn't touch on it, but sort of task-specific imaging. So when I look at mutual information, it's a global metric. It encompasses everything that I can try to get about my object captured on a measurement. But if I don't want to reconstruct an image and I just want to detect that there's an object moving in my image, or if I want to detect just the color green in my image, I could make a specialized imager that focuses on maximizing the information corresponding to that task. And that's another way that I could push the performance even further. If I wanted an imager that's just going to segment my object, maybe I don't want to bother at all with this kind of resolution or this kind of quality improvement. Maybe I just want to focus on edge detection. And maybe there's a better mask I can use for edge detection than I could do for general reconstruction. Yeah, great point. Thank you.
For your mutual information estimation, is there a good perceptual metric? Like, how much information can I lose before I notice it?
That's a great question. So I think that it's hard to think about how this works perceptually. And I think an example is these things where some of the objects, the information goes up. And another example is these sorts of sensor measurements. Like, I can't see visually that this might be the most informationally optimal sensor measurement. And this is one of the places where machine learning and the black box magic of algorithms helps, because they're able to detect patterns our visual system may not. So maybe the question to ask would be, is visual or perceptual metrics the correct indicator of information encoding? Like, it's possible that something that looks good to me has very low information because it has these variations that I can't detect with my eye. So I think that I'm not sure perceptual would be the best way to go in terms of evaluating how much information I lose. Pixel variation would be maybe better. I'm using a Basler board level sensor. So it's a pretty cheap Sony sensor, about 300, 400 bucks. I guess not that cheap, but in terms of compared to a scientific camera, I'm just using a very simple sensor.
One last question.
Does the does the type of image that, or the sparsity, kind of inform you more on the actual design of the base mask, or is it like you have this one form of design and then go for it?
Let me think if I got that. So you're asking in terms of like, how can I use the sparsity to inform my design? Yeah, so I think that's kind of the premise of what I'm proposing for future design, is looking at them jointly. So if I know what my object sparsity is, I can look at how the output will be. But if I look at just my object sparsity on its own, I'm not sure that isolated from the encoder is particularly informative. Yeah.
Thank our speaker.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye, Zoom people. Thanks for